All right, I'm reading from H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, The Outline of History, a book from 1920, an original, and reading the beginning of Christianity because they co opted the story of Jesus. It's very sad to be so fucking centered. A beautiful woman with a beautiful mind, a little rough on the edges, but hey. So we're reading from H.G. Wells. I will be reading in my British accent. And to establish, how they included sacrifices and salvation in Christianity, everything to keep you, this whole construct to keep you from going within. And as someone who spent a lot of time trying to figure out how this construct works. All right, so for we have to remember that a death by crucifixion is hardly more bloody death than hanging. To speak of Jesus shedding his blood for mankind is really a most inaccurate expression, even when we remember that he was scourged, that he wore a crown of thorns, and then his side was pierced by a spear. We are still far from a fountain filled with blood. But Mithraism centered upon some new, now forgotten mysteries about Mithridates sacrificing a sacred and benevolent bull. All the Mithriac shrines seem to have contained the figure of Mithridates killing this bull, which bleeds copiously from a wound in its side, and from this blood a new life sprang. There is that image of the bull with the bees. The Mithraist votary actually bathed in the blood of the sacrificial bull and was born again thereby. Wow, I wonder where we get this story. And as his initiation, he went beneath the scaffolding on which the bull was killed, and the blood ran down on him. Sparkles. The contributions of the Alexandrian cult of Christian thought and practices were even more considerable in the personality of Horus, who was at once the son of Serapis and identical with Serapis in the struggles with the Pauline mysteries. From that, the identification of Mary with Isis and her elevation to a rank quasi-divine, in spite of the saying of Jesus about his mother and his brothers that we have already quoted, was also a very natural step. Reading from H.G. Wells' 1920s book, The Outline of History, the chapter The Beginnings of Christianity, because I'm a heretic. And I remember, natural too was it for Christianity to adopt almost insensibly the practice methods of the popular religions of the time. Its priests took on the head shaving and the characteristic garments of the Egyptian priests, because that sort of thing seemed to be the right way of distinguishing a priest. One accretion followed another, almost insensibly. The originally revolutionary teaching of Jesus was buried under these customary acquisitions. We have already tried to imagine Gautama Buddha returning to Tibet and his amazement at the worship of his own image in Lhasa. We will but suggest the parallel amazement of some earnest Nazarene who had known and followed his dusty and travel-worn master through the dry sunlight of Galilee, restored suddenly to this world and visiting, let us say, a mass in St. Peter's at Rome, and learning that the consecrated wafer upon the altar was none other than the crucified teacher. It's a little bit of, um, to eat the blood and the body. The body, isn't that like, what are they called? The people who eat cannibals. Religion in the world community is not many things but one thing, and it was inevitable that all living religions, faiths in the world at the time, and all the philosophy and religious thought that came into contact with Christianity should come into an account with Christianity, exchange phrases with ideas. The hopes of the early Nazarenes had identified Jesus with the Christ. The brilliant mind of Paul had surrounded his career with mystical significance. Jesus had called men and women to a giant undertaking, to the renunciation of self, to the new birth into the kingdom of love. The line of least resistance for the flagging convert was to intellectualize himself away from the plain doctrine, this stark proposition, into complicated theories and ceremonies that would leave his essential self alone. How much easier is it to sprinkle oneself with blood than to purge oneself with malice and competition? To eat bread and drink wine and pretend one had absorbed divinity, to give candles rather than the heart, to shave the head and retain the scheming privacy of the brain inside it. The world, with full of such evasive philosophy and theological stuff in the opening centuries of the Christian era. It is not for us here to enlarge upon the distinctive features of Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Philonism, and the like teachings which abounded in the Alexandrian world. But it was still one world, with that in which the early Christians were living. The writings of such men as Origen and Plotinus and Augustine witness to the inevitable give and take of the time. They had astrologers, they killed the astrologers, just like they killed the witches, just like they digitally kill Mariams today. People who stand for divine truth and nothing but the truth. And one must go inside and tap into their higher selves and trust. For if they want the truth and they hold the divine sword of truth and nothing but, no matter what, they will get it. If they trust where they're being directed and their heart is pure. But how many's hearts are pure? How many even have hearts left? It's been their higher self, so much emphasis on logic. Jesus called himself the Son of God and also the Son of Man, which is a take also from the Son of. But he laid little stress on who he was or what he was, and much upon the teachings of the kingdom. In declaring that he was more than a man and divine, Paul and his other followers, whether they were right or wrong, opened up a vast field of argument. Was Jesus God? Or had God created him? Was he identical with God or separate from God? And there you see all of the inner fightings, the little variations in Christianity, right? Because Jesus would want you to go and get a vaccine, right, Daddy? Why would you trust your immune system? Better to trust Rockefeller medicine. And repent, 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 repent. Ask for forgiveness. You know, now you could fight over little details. Is it not the function of the historian to answer such questions, but he is bound to note them, to note how unavoidable they were, because of the immense influences they have upon the whole subsequent life of Western mankind. By the fourth century of the Christian era, We find all the Christians community so agitated and exasperated by torturous and elusive arguments about the nature of God as to be largely negligent of the simpler teachings of charity, service, and brotherhood that Jesus had inculcated. So all of these Christian rights, I'm a Christian. Really? Are you really a Christian? Are you really a Christian? Because I could say that I feel more Christ-like, not to make myself better than my people like my dad, but I believe it's an energy that you can embody Christ consciousness in your heart to be in service and with all the fear around, to still be in abundance and to have faith, which is not easy. The chief views that the historian notices are those of the Arians, the Sabellians, and the Trinitarians. The Arians followed Arius, who taught that Christ was less than God. The Sabellians taught that he was a mode of or aspect of God. God was creator, savior, and comforter, just as one many be father, trustee, and guest. The Trinitarians, of whom Athanasius was the great leader, taught that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost were three distinct personas, but one God. The reader, what a salad of confusion on purpose. The reader is referred to the Athanasian Creed for the exact expression of the latter mystery and for the alarming consequences to him of any failure to grasp and believe it. To Gibbon, he must go for a derivative statement of these controversies. The present writer can deal with them neither with awe nor derision. They seem to him, he must confess, a disastrous ebullition of the human mind, entirely inconsistent with the plain account of Jesus preserved for us in the Gospels. Orthodoxy became a test not only for Christian office, but for Christian trade and help. A small point of doctrine might mean affluence or beggary to a man. A small point of doctrines might mean it is difficult to read the surviving literature of the time without a strong sense of the dogmatism, the spites, rivalries, and pedantries of the men who tore Christianity to pieces for the sake of these theological refinements. Most of the Trinitarian disputants, for it is chiefly Trinitarian documents that survive, accuse the antagonists, probably with truth, of mean and secondary motives, but they do so in a manner that betrays their own base spirit very clearly. Arius, for example, is accused of adopting heretical opinions because he was not appointed Bishop of Alexandria. Riots and excommunications and banishments, sound familiar? Punctuated these controversies and finally came to official persecutions. And here we are, still persecuted, those persecuted. And let's not forget that the divine feminine, those who embody the divine feminine, that the divine feminine is very persecuted. So because how many women are acting like men? It's all an attack on your innate divinity and on love between a man and a woman who are balanced within and who work together. This vapid materialism. If you love me, you're gonna get me this car. And so I spit on it all. It's just so mediocre. What can I say? I know everybody has their karma and dharma. You could come here under the transhumanist agenda and keep doing it over and over and over again because it does take many, many, many lifetimes for the soul to evolve. And then you get to the point where you're like, this ain't my first rodeo. I've come here thousands of times before. I'm ready. I came for this. I came for this. I came to shine my frequency. And I'm not going to be a victim to the severe fear and distractions and bullshit to take me off my path. These fine differences above about the constitution of the deity interwove with politics and international disputes. Men have quarreled over business affairs, wives who wished to annoy their husbands developed antagonistic views upon this exalted theme. Most of the barbarian invaders of the empire were Aryans, probably because their simple minds found the Trinitarian position incomprehensible. It's easy for the skeptic to mock at these disputes. But even if we think that these attempts to say exactly how God was related to himself were presumptuous and intellectually monstrous, nevertheless we are bound to recognize that beneath these preposterous refinements of impossible dogmas, there lay often a real passion for truth, even if it was a truth ill conceived. Both sides produced genuine martyrs, and the zeal of these controversies, though it is a base and often malicious zeal, did, at any rate, make the Christian sects very energetically propagandist and educational. Moreover, because the history of the Christian body in the 4th and 5th centuries is largely a record of these unhappy disputes, that must not blind us to the fact that the Spirit of Jesus did live and ennoble many lives among the Christians. The text of the Gospels, though it was probably tampered with during this period, was not destroyed, and Jesus of Nazareth, in his own manifest, inimitable greatness, still taught through the text. Nor did these unhappy quarrels prevent Christianity from maintaining a united front against gladiator shows and against the degrading worship of idols and of the god Caesar. So far as it has challenged the divinity of Caesar and the characteristic institutions of the empire, Christianity is to be regarded as a rebellious and disintegrating movement. And so it was regarded by most of the emperors before Constantine the Great. It encountered considerable hostility and at last systematic attempts to suppress it. Decius was the first emperor to organize an official prosecution, and the great era of the martyrs was the time of Diocletian. The persecution of Diocletian was indeed the crowning struggle of the old idea of the God Emperor against the already great and powerful organization that denied his divinity. Diocletian had reorganized the monarchy upon lines of extreme absolutionism. He had abolished the last vestiges of republican institutions. He was the first emperor to surround himself completely with the awe-inspiring etiquette of an Eastern monarch. He was forged by the logic of his assumption to attempt, this is the beginnings of Christianity from H.G. Wells, 1921, I think. He was forced by the logic of his assumptions to attempt the complete eradication of a system that flatly denied them. The test in the persecution was that the Christian was required to offer sacrifices to the emperor. Quote, though Diocletian, still averse to the effusion of blood, had moderated the fury of Galerius, who proposed that everyone refusing to offer sacrifice should immediately be burnt alive. The penalty is so Christian-like, right? Be deemed sufficiently rigorous. The penalties inflicted on the obstinacy of the Christians might be deemed sufficiently rigorous and effectual. It was enacted that the churches in all the provinces of the empire should be demolished to their foundations, and the punishment of any secret assemblies for the purpose of religious worship. The philosophers, who now assumed the unworthy office of directing the blind zeal of a persecution, had diligently studied the nature and genius of the Christian religion. And as they were not ignorant by the speculative doctrines of the faith, were supposed to be contained to the writings of the prophets, of the evangelists, and of the apostles, they most probably suggested the order that the bishops and presbyters should deliver all the sacred books into the hands of the magistrates, who were commanded on the severest penalties to burn them in a public and solemn manner. That's nice. Here we have a instance of book burning that has happened over and over and over and over and over again. And I mean, they've scrubbed me. It's like vanishing of the bees. How about vanishing of the bee lady? Vanishing. Oh, yeah. I put out a new book. I have a show. I have a Substack. I'm working all the time. And I only become alive when someone else puts me on the show. But what happens when, someone like Jeff Berwick puts the interview I did on my channel, on his show, and gets insta-banned and a week in YouTube jail? What does that say? What's the take-home message? By the same edict, the property of the church was at once confiscated, in several parts of which it might consist were either sold to the highest bidder, united to the imperial domain, bestowed on the cities or corporations, or granted to the solicitations of rapacious couriers. After taking such factual measures to abolish the worship and to dissolve the government of the Christians, it was as though it was thought necessary to subject to the most intolerable hardships the condition of those perverse individuals who should still reject the religion of nature, of Rome, and of the ancestors. Persons of a liberal birth were declared incapable of holding any honors or employments. Slaves were forever deprived of the hopes of freedom, and the whole body of the Christians were put out of the protection of the law. The judges were authorized to hear and to determine every action that was brought against a Christian, but the Christians were not permitted to complain of any injury which they themselves had suffered, and those unfortunate sectaries were exposed to the severity while they were excluded to the benefits of public justice. This edict was scarcely exhibited to the public view. In the most suspicious, spacious place in Nicomedia, before it was torn down by the hands of a Christian, who expressed at the same time, by the bitterest of invectives, his contempt as well as abhorrence for such impious and tyrannical governors. His offense, according to the mildest laws, amounted to treason and deserved death. And if to be true that he was a person of rank and education, those circumstances could serve only to aggravate his guilt. He was burnt, or rather roasted, by a slow fire, and his executioner, zealous to revenge the personal insult which had been offered to the emperors, exhausted every refinement of cruelty, without being able to subdue his patience or to alter the steadying and insulting smile which is his dying agonies he still preserved in his countenance. So, with the death of the unnamed martyr, the great persecution opened. But, as Gibbon points out, our information as to its severity is of very doubtful value. His estimates the total of victims are about 2,000, and contrasts this with the known multitudes of Christians martyred by their fellow Christians during the period of the Reformation. The killing of anything that is threatening others, has been going on for a long time, inserting bloodshed and sacrifice, not what Jesus talked about, really, if Jesus existed. And if you are a Christian, you should do your fucking homework. And if someone's like, I don't believe in that, but I've looked into it, and you haven't. So when you do your research and then you use your internal compass and not be, you have no bone in the game. I just want the truth. Instead of like, I don't believe that. Well, have you looked into it? No, you haven't. I believe the word of Christ. Gibbon was strongly prejudiced against Christianity, and here he seems disposed to minimize the fortitude and sufferings of the Christians. In many provinces, no doubt. So, I mean, they were reformed. The true Christians that followed Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarenes, and then over time, kind of beat into something else, you could say. Gibbon was strongly prejudiced against Christianity, and here he seems disposed to minimize the fortitude and sufferings of the Christians. In many provinces, no doubt, there must have been a great reluctance to enforce the edict. But there was a hunt for the copious copies of Holy Writ. And in many places, a systemic destruction of Christian churches. There were tortures and executions, as well as great crowding of the gaols with Christian presbyters and bishops. We have to remember that the Christian community was now a very considerable element of the population, and that an influential proportion of the officials charged with the execution of the edict were themselves of the prescribed faith. Whatever. Galerius, who was in control of the eastern provinces, was among the most vigorous of the persecutors. But in the end, on his deathbed, it says 371 because we could have been living, we did at one point live. And if you think, okay, live 300 years, and how many lives to evolve my soul, to achieve self-realization, to remember, it takes more than one, that's for sure. Maybe thousands. He realized the futility of his attacks upon this huge community, and granted toleration in an edict, the gist of which Gibbons translates as follows. Among the important cares which have occupied our mind for the utility and preservation of the empire, it was our intention to correct and reestablish all things according to the ancient laws and public disciplines of the Romans. We have not stopped rewriting. Let's topple this building. Let's call this fucking university fucking George Floyd University. Will the generations to come know that George Floyd was a fucking criminal? No. Will they know that he was an FBI informant? No. Are there some people who have the courage to immortalize the truth? Yeah. Buy my book. Go to maryminate.com and buy my book. It is $66.66, and that's cheap because this book will be hundreds in the future. That's how those books go now. Anything that hasn't been destroyed. I know it. So $66.66 because, yeah, the devil's all over this. You could use GF Book to get 15% off. You could get a signed copy. I'm not suicidal if something were to happen to me, regardless. We were particularly desirous of reclaiming into the way of reason and nature the deluded Christians who had renounced the religion and ceremonies instituted by the fathers, and presumptuously despising the practice of antiquity, had invented extravagant laws and opinions according to the dictates of the fancy, and had collected various society from the different provinces of our empire. The edicts The edicts have been published to enforce the worship of the gods, having exposed many of the Christians to danger and distress, many having suffered death, and many more who still persist in the impious folly, being left destitute of any public exercises of religion. We are disposed to extend to those unhappy men the effects of our wanted elemency. We permit them, therefore, freely to profess their private opinions and to assemble in the conventicles without fear or molestation, provided always that they preserve a due respect to the established laws and government. So far, does this have anything to do with heart and love and peace and joy and forgiveness and helping others? No, this is all politics and bullshit and control. We permit them, therefore, freely to profess their private opinions and to assemble in the conventicles without fear of molestation. By another rescript, we shall signify our intentions to the judges and magistrates, and we hope that our indulgences will engage the Christians to offer up their prayers to the deity whom they adore, for our safety and prosperity, for their own and for that of the Republic. In a few years, Constantine the Great was reigning, first as associated emperor and then as the sole ruler. And the severer trials of Christianity were over. If Christianity was a rebellious and destructive force towards a pagan Rome, it was a unifying and organizing force within its own communion. This fact, the genius of Constantine grasped the spirit of Jesus for all the doctrinal dissensions that prevailed made a great Freemasonry throughout and even beyond the limits of the empire. Let's mark it Jesus, right? The faith was spreading among the barbarians beyond the border. It had extended into Persia and Central Asia. It provided the only hope of moral solidarity. Had the moral solidarity he could discern in the great welter of narrow views and self-seeking over which he had to rule. Let's use Jesus. It and it alone had the faculties for organizing will, for the need of which the empire was falling to pieces like a piece of rotten cloth. In 312, Constantine had to fight for Rome and his position against Maxentius. He put the Christian monogram upon the shields and banners of his troops and claimed that the God of the Christians had fought for him in his complete victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome. By this act, he renounced all these pretensions to divinity that the vanity of Alexander the Great had first brought into the Western world. Ego, power, ego, control. Nothing to do with Jesus. And with the applause and enthusiastic support of the Christians, he established himself as a monarch, more absolute even than Diocletian. In a few years' time, Christianity had become the official religion of the empire. And in AD 337, Constantine, upon his deathbed, was baptized as a Christian. The figure of the Constantine the Great is at least as cardinal in history as that of Alexander the Great or Augustus Caesar. We know very little of his personality, of his private life. No Plutarch, no Suetonius had preserved any intimate and living details about him. Abuse we have of him from his enemies, and much obviously fulsome panegyric to set against it, but none of these writers give us a living character of him. He is a party symbol for them, a partisan flag. It is stated by the hostile Zosimus that, like Sargon, he was of illegitimate birth. His father was a distinguished general, and his mother, Elena, an innkeeper's daughter of Nish in Serbia. Gibbon, however, is of opinion that there was a valid marriage. In any case, it was a lowly marriage, and a personal genius of Constantine prevailed against serious disadvantages. He was comparatively illiterate. He knew little or no Greek. He was, it appears to be true that he banished his eldest son, Crispus, and caused him to be executed at the instigation of the young man's stepmother, Fausta. And it is also recorded that he was afterwards convinced of the innocence of Crispus and caused Fausta to be executed, according to one account, by being boiled to death in her bath. Nice. And according to another, by being exposed naked to wild beasts as a desolate mountain on a desolate mountain, while there is also very satisfactory documentary evidence that she survived him. If she was executed, the fact remains that her three sons, together with two nephews, became the appointed heirs of Constantine. Clearly, there is nothing solid to be got from this libellous tangle, and such souffle as it is possible with these scanty materials is to be found admirably done by the Gibbon. Gibbon, because of his anti Christian animus, is hostile to Constantine, but he admits that he was temperate and chaste. He accuses him of prodigality because of his great public buildings and of being vain and dissolute because in his old age he was a wig. He wore a wig. Gibbon wore his own hair tied with a becoming black bow and a diadem and magnificent robes. But all the later emperors after Diocletian wore diadem and magnificent robes. Yet, if the personality of Constantine the Great remains phantom like, if the particulars of his domestic life reveal nothing but a vague tragedy, we can still guess as much that he was in his mind. It must be in the closing years of his life have been a very lonely mind. He was more of an autocrat than any previous emperor had been. That is to say, he had less counsel and help. No class of public, spirited, and trustworthy men remained. No senate, no council shared and developed his schemes. How much he apprehended the geographical weakness of the empire, how far he saw the complete disaster that was now so near, we can only guess. He made his real capital at Nicomedia in Bithynia. Constantinople across the Bosphorus was still being built when he died. Like Diocletian, he seems to have realized the broken backed outline of his dominions and to have concentrated his attention on foreign affairs and more particularly on the affairs of Hungary, South Russia, and the Black Sea. He reorganized all the official machinery of the empire. He gave it a new constitution and sought to establish a dynasty. He was a restless remaker of things. The social confusion he tried to fix by assisting in the development of a caste system. This was following up the work of his great predecessor, Diocletian. He tried to make a caste of the peasants and small cultivators and tried and to restrict them from moving from their holdings. In fact, he sought to make them serfs. The supply of slave labor had fallen off because the empire was no longer an invaded power. He returned to serfdom as the remedy. His creative efforts necessitated unprecedentedly heavy taxation. All these things point to a lonely and forcible mind. It is in his manifest understanding of the need of some unifying moral force, if the empire was to hold together, that his claim to originality lies. It was only after he had turned to Christianity that seemed to have realized the fierce dissensions of the theologians. He made a great effort to reconcile these differences in order to have one uniform and harmonious teachings in the community. And at his initiative, a general council of the church was held at Nicaea. Yes, Nicaea. I remember. Where you removed the text on reincarnation. A town near Nicomedia and over against Constantinople in 325. Eusebius gives a curious account of this strange gathering over which the emperor, although he was not yet a baptized Christian, presided. It was not his first council of the church, for he had already in 313 presided over a council at Arles. He sat in the middle of the council of Nicaea upon a golden throne, and as he had little Greek, we must suppose he was reduced to watching the countenances and gestures of the debaters and listening to their intonations. The council was a stormy one. When old Arius rose to speak, one Nicholas of Myra struck him in the face, and afterwards many ran out, thrusting their fingers into their ears in affected horror at the old man's heresies. One is tempted to imagine the great emperor deeply anxious for the soul of his empire, firmly resolved to end these divisions, bending towards his interpreters to ask them the meaning of the uproar. The views that prevailed at Nicaea were embodied in the Nicene Creed, a strictly Trinitarian statement, and the emperor sustained the Trinitarian position. But afterwards, when Athanasius bore too hardly upon the Arians, he had him banished from Alexandria, and when the Church of Alexandria would have excommunicated Arius, he obliged it to redmit him to communion. So I wonder if they're going to say anything about the reincarnation, if he's going to say anything. This is the outline of history of all three people. Such silliness. Such silliness. Okay, so this date, 325 AD, is a very convenient date in our history. It is the date of the first complete general council of the entire Christian world. That at Arles we have mentioned had been a gathering of only the western half. It marks the definitive entry upon the stage of human affairs of the Christian church and of Christianity, as it is generally understood in the world today. It marks the exact definition of Christian teaching by the Nicene Creed. You better mention reincarnation. It is necessary that we should recall the reader's attention to the profound difference between this fully developed Christianity of Nicaea and the Jesus of Nazareth. All Christians hold the latter is completely contained in the former, but that is a question outside our province. What is clearly apparent is that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth was a prophetic teaching of the new type that began with the Hebrew prophets. It was not priestly. It had no consecrated temple, no altar. It had no rites and ceremonies. Its sacrifice was a broken and contrite heart. Its only organization was an organization of preachers, and its chief function was a sermon. But the fully fledged Christianity of the 4th century, though it preserved as its nucleus the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, was mainly a priestly religion of a type already familiar to the world for thousands of years. The center of its elaborate ritual was an altar and the essential act of worship, the sacrifice, by a consecrated priest of the Mass, and it had a rapidly developing organization of deacons, priests, and bishops, aka a hierarchy. But if Christianity had taken on an extraordinary outward resemblance to the cults of Serapia, Ammon, or Bel Marduk, we must remember that even its priestcraft had certain novel features. Nowhere did it possess any quasi divine image of a god. There was no head temple containing the god, because God was everywhere, including the stars. There was no head temple. There was no Holy of Holies. Its widespread altars were all addressed to the unseen universal Trinity. Even in its most archaic aspects, there was in Christianity something new. A very important thing for us to note is the role played by the emperor in the fixation of Christianity. Not only was the Council of Nicaea assembled by Constantine the Great, but all the great councils, the two at Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, were called together by the imperial power. And it is very manifest that in much of the history of Christianity at this time, the spirit of Constantine the Great is as evident as, or more evident than, the spirit of Jesus. He was, we have said, a pure autocrat. The last vestiges of Roman republicanism had vanished in the days of the Aurelian and Diocletian. To the best of his lights, he was trying to remake the crazy empire while there was yet time, and he worked without any counselors, any public opinion, or any sense of the need of such aids and checks. The idea of stamping out all controversy and division, stamping out all thought by imposing one dogmatic creed upon all believers, is an altogether autocratic idea. It is the idea of the single handed man who reveals that to work at all, he must be free from opposition and criticism. The history of the church under his influence became now, therefore, a history of the violent struggles that were bound to follow upon his sudden and rough summons to unanimity. From him, the church acquired the disposition to be authoritative and unquestioned, to develop a centralized organization and run parallel to the empire. Church and state. A second great autocrat who presently contributed to the stamping upon Catholic Christianity of a distinctly authoritative character was Theodosius. So he's not going to say anything here about reincarnation because it doesn't seem so. Theodosius the Great. He forbade the unorthodox to hold meetings, handed over all churches to the Trinitarians, and overthrew the heathen temples throughout the empire. And in 390, he caused the great statue of Serapis at Alexandria to be destroyed. Why, boys and girls? Because we've been destroying statues forever. There was to be no rivalry, no qualification to the rigid unity of the church. Here, we cannot tell of the vast internal troubles of the church, its indigestions of the heresy of Arians and Paulicians of Gnostics and Manichaeans. Had it been less authoritative and more tolerant of intellectual variety, it might perhaps have been a still more powerful than it became. But in spite of all these disorders, it did not seem, it did for some time maintain a conception of human unity, more intimate and far wider than was ever achieved. By the 5th century, Christendom was already becoming greater, sturdier, and more enduring than any empire had ever been, because it was something not merely imposed upon men, but interwoven with the texture of their minds. It reached out far beyond the outmost limits of the empire, into Armenia, Persia, Abyssinia, Ireland, Germany, India, Turkestan. Though made up of a widely scattered congregations, was thought of as one body of Christ, one people of God. This idea unity found impressions in many ways. Intercommunication between the various Christian communities was very active. Christians upon a journey were always sure of a warm welcome and a hospitable entertainment for their fellow disciples. I really do wonder what the exact reincarnation texts said. I wonder if they exist anywhere. Messengers and letters were sent freely from one church to another. Missionaries and evangelists were continually from place to place. Documents of various kinds, including gospels and apostolic epistles, circulated widely. Thus, in various ways, the feeling of unity found expression, and the development of widely separated parts of Christendom conformed more or less closely to a common type. Christendom retained at least the formal tradition of this general unity of spirits until 1054, when the Latin speaking Western Church and the main and original Greek speaking Church, the Orthodox Church, severed themselves from one another. So much fighting! So much fighting, Christians! Why? ¿Por qué? Upon the questions of adding 2 words to the creed, the older creed had declared that the Holy Ghost proceeded from the Father. The Latins wanted to add and did add filioque and from the Son, and placed the Greeks out of the communion because they would not follow the lead. But already, as early as the 5th century, the Christians in eastern Syria, Persia, Central Asia, there were churches at Merv, Herat, and Samarkand, and India had detached themselves on a similar score. These extremely interesting Asiatic Christians are known in history as the Nestorian Church, and their influence extended into China. The Egyptian and Abyssinian churches also detached themselves very early upon similarly inexplicable points. Long before this formal separation of the Latin and Greek speaking halves of the main church, however, there was a practical separation following upon the breaking up of the empire. The conditions diverged from the first while the Greek speaking Eastern Empire held together, and the emperor at Constantinople remained dominant in the church. The Latin half of the empire, as we have already told, collapsed, had left the church free of any such imperial control. Moreover, while ecclesiastical authority in the Empire of Constantinople was divided between the high bishops or patriarchs of Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, authority in the West was concentrated in the patriarch or the Pope of Rome. The Bishop of Rome had already been recognized as first among the patriarchs, and all these things conspired to justify exceptional pretensions upon his part to a quasi imperial authority. With the final fall of the Western Empire, he took over the ancient titles of Pontifex, Maximus, which the emperors had held, and to become the supreme sacrificial priest of the Roman tradition. Over the Christians of the West, his supremacy was fully recognized, but from the beginning it had to be urged with discretion with the dominions of the Eastern Emperor and the jurisdictions of the other four patriarchs. Ideas of worldly rule by the church was already prevalent in the 4th century. St. Augustine, a citizen of Hippo in North Africa, who wrote between 354 and 430, gave expression to the developing political ideas of the church in his book, The City of God. The City of God leads the mind very directly towards the possibility of making the world into a theological and organized kingdom of heaven. Fuck St. Augustine. The city, as Augustine puts it, is a spiritual society of the predestined faithful. But the step from that is a political application was not a very wide one. The church was to be the ruler of the world over all nations. The divinely led ruling power over a great league of terrestrial states. In later years, these ideas developed into a definitive political theory and policy. As the barbarian races settled and became Christian, the Pope began to claim an overlordship of the kings. In a few centuries, the Pope had become, in theory, and to a certain extent in practice, the high priest, censor, judge, and divine monarch of Christendom. His influence extended to the West, far beyond the utmost range of the old empire, to Ireland, Norway, and Sweden, and all over Germany. For more than 1,000 years, this idea of the unity of Christendom, of Christendom, is a sort of vast amphiktyony, whose members, even in wartime, were constrained from many extremities by the ideas of a common brotherhood and a common loyalty to the church-dominated Europe. The history of Europe from the 5th century onward is to the 15th is very largely the history of the failure of this great idea of a divine world government to realize itself in practice. So, this is the outline of history by H.G. Wells, 1920, the chapter on the beginnings of Christianity. A lot of fighting and corruption of the exalted Jesus, who stands for the exalted man. Let's see how much more in this chapter. We have already given an account in the previous chapter of the chief eruptions of the barbarian races. We may now, with the help of a map, make a brief review of the political divisions of Europe at the close of the 5th century. No vestige of the Western Empire, the original Roman Empire, remained as a distinct and separate political division. Politically, it was completely broken up. Over many parts of Europe, a sort of legendary overlordship of the Hellenic Eastern Empire, as the empire held its place in men's minds. The emperor at Constantinople was, in theory, at least still emperor. In Britain, the quite barbaric Teutonic Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had conquered the eastern half of England. In the west of the island of the Britons still held out, but were gradually being forced back into Wales and Cornwall. The Anglo-Saxons seem to have been among the most ruthless and effective of barbarian conquerors. For wherever they prevailed, their language completely replaced the Celtic or Latin speech. It is not certain which used by the British. These Anglo-Saxons were as yet not Christianized. Most of Gaul, Holland, and the Rhineland was under the fairly vigorous, Christianized, and more civilized kingdom of the Franks. But the Rhone Valley was under the separate kingdom of the Burgundians. Spain and some of the south of France was under the rule of the Visigoths, but the Suevi were at possession of the northwest corner of the peninsula. Of the Vandal kingdom in Africa, we have already written, and Italy, Cyllenids. Populations inhabit Rome and came under the rule of the Ostrogoths. There was no emperor left in Rome. Theodoric I ruled there at first of a line of Gothic kings, and his rule extended across the Alps into Pannonia and down the Adriatic to Dalmatia and Serbia. To the east of the Gothic kingdom, the emperors of Constantinople ruled definitively. The Bulgars were still at this time a Mongolian tribe of horse riding nomads in the region of the Volga. The Aryan Serbs had recently come southward to the shores of the Black Sea into the original home of the Visigoths, the Turkish Finnish. Magyars were not yet in Europe. The Lombards were as yet north of the Danube. The 6th century was marked by a phase of vigor on the part of the Eastern Empire under the Emperor Justinian. The Vandal kingdom was recovered in 534. The Goths were expelled from Italy in 553, so soon as Justinian was dead, and the Lombards descended into Italy and settled in Lombardy, but they left Ravenna, Rome, southern Italy, and North Africa under the rule of the Eastern Empire. Wow, it's been doing this for a long time. These warring, so Christian-like. Such was the political condition of the world in which the idea of Christendom developed. The daily life of the time was going on at a very low level indeed, physically, intellectually, and morally. It is frequently said that Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries relapsed into barbarism, but that does not express the reality of the case. It is far more correct to say that the civilization of the Roman Empire had passed into a phase of extreme demoralization. Barbarism is a social order of an elementary type, orderly within its limits, but the state of Europe beneath its political fragmentation was a social disorder. Its morale was not that of a kraal, Kraal, but that of a slum. In a savage kraal, a savage knows that he belongs to a community and lives and sets and acts accordingly. In a slum, the individual neither knows or nor acts in relation to any greater being. Only very slowly and weakly did Christianity restore that lost sense of community and teach men to rally about the ideas of Christendom. The social and economic structures of the Roman Empire was in ruins. That civilization had been a civilization of wealth and political power sustained by the limitation and slavery of the great mass of mankind. It had presented a spectacle of outward splendor and luxuries, refinement, but beneath that brave outward show was cruelty, stupidity, and stagnation. It had to break down. It had to be removed before anything better could replace it. We have already called attention to the intellectual deadness. For 3 centuries, it had produced neither sciences nor literature of any importance. It is only where men are to be found neither too rich and powerful to be tempted into the extravagant indulgences, nor too poor and limited to care for anything beyond the daily need, that those disinterested curiosities and serene impulses can have play that gave sane philosophy and science and great art to the world, and the plutocracy of Rome had made such a class impossible. When men and women are unlimited and unrestrained, the evidence of history shows clearly that they're all liable to become monsters of self indulgences. When, on the other hand, they are driven and unhappy, then their impulses is towards immoderate, tragical resorts, towards wild revolts, or towards the austerities and intensities of religion. It is not perhaps true to say that the world became miserable in these dark ages, to which we now have come much nearer. The truth is, it's to say that the violent and vulgar fraud of Roman imperialism, that world of politicians, adventurers, landowners, and financiers, collapsed into a sea of misery that was already there. All the histories of these times are very imperfect. There were very few places where men could write, and little encouragement to write at all. No one was sure even of the safety of his manuscript, or the possibility of it being read. Buy my book. Go to maryminade.com/George Floyd book and get a copy. Someone might be reading it like I am in the future to mark the truth, which is constantly being rewritten and vaporized. But we know enough to tell that this age was an age not merely of war and robbery, but of famine and pestilence. No effective sanitary organization had yet come into the world. Oh, look, there's actual people reading here. Hi. I didn't see that there was a chat. Hi, Polly. I'm reading from H.G. Wells. This is a 1920 book. It's very old. And I'm reading the chapter on the beginnings of Christianity. I'm almost done. I don't know about the British accent. It's been doing it since I was 16 or something. No, that's not true. Like 10. Okay. No effective sanitary organization had yet come to the world, and the migrations of the time must have destroyed whatever hygienic balance had been established. Attila's ravages in North Italy were checked by an outbreak of fever in 452. There was a great epidemic of bubonic plague towards the end of the reign of Justinian, which did much to weaken the defenses of Italy against the Lombards. Again, we don't know if he's saying full truth. You have to be discerning of everything. Because he talked about the Council of Nicaea, but did not mention the fact that reincarnation was removed, perhaps because it's not very important to the outline of history, although I would beg to differ. In 543, 10,000 people had died in one day in Constantinople. Plague was raging in Rome in 590. The 7th century was also a plague-stricken century. The Englishman Bede, one of the few writers of the time, records pestilences in England in 664, 672, 678, 683, no fewer than 4 in 20 years. Gibbon couples the Justinian epidemic with the Great Comet of 531 and with the very frequent and serious earthquakes of that reign. Quote, many cities of the east were left vacant, and in several districts of Italy, the harvest and the vintage withered on the ground. He alleges a visible decrease of the human species, which has never been made good in some of the fairest countries of the globe. To many in these dark days, it seemed that all learning and all that made life seemingly undesirable was perishing. How far the common lot was unhappier under these conditions of squalor and insecurity than it had been under the grinding order of the imperial system, it is impossible to say. There was possibly much local variations, the rule of violent bullies here and a good tempered freedom there, famine this year and plenty the next. If robbers abounded, tax gatherers and creditors had disappeared. Such kings as those of the Frankish and Gothic kingdoms were really phantom rulers to most of the so called subjects. The life of each district went on at a low level with little trade or travel. Greater or lesser areas of countryside would be dominated by some able person claiming with more or less justice a little the title of lord or count or duke from the tradition of the later empire from the king. Such local nobles would assemble bands of retainers and build themselves strongholds. Often they adapted pre-existing buildings, the Colosseum at Rome, for example, the arena of many great gladiatorial shows, was converted into a fortress and now it's a tourist spot. And so was the amphitheater at Arles. So also was the great tomb of Hadrian at Rome. In the decaying and now insanitary towns and cities, shrunken bodies of artisans would hold together and serve the needs of the cultivating villages upon them by their industry, placing themselves under the protection of some adjacent noble. A very important share in the social recrystallization that went on the 6th and 7th centuries after the breakdown and fusion of the 4th and 5th was taken by the Christian mono, monoastic orders that were now arising in the Western world. Monasteries had existed in the world before Christianity during the period of social unhappiness among the Jews before the time of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a sect of Essenes who lived apart in communities, vowed to austere lives of solitude, purity, and self denial. Self denial, it's an interesting word to choose. Buddhism, too, had developed the communities of men who withdrew from the general effort. I guess I'm withdrawing and commerce of the world to lead lives of austerity and contemplation. Instead, the story of Buddha, as we have told it, shows that such ideas must have prevailed in India long before his time and that at last he repudiated them. Quite early in the history of Christianity, arose a similar movement away from the competition and heat and stress of the daily life of men. In Egypt, particularly, great numbers of men and women went out into the desert and there lived solitary lives of prayer and contemplation, living in absolute poverty in caves or under rocks, and subsisting on the chance alms of those who the holiness impressed. Such lives would signify little to the historian. They were, they are indeed of their very nature lives withdrawn from history. Were it not for the turn this monastic tendency presently took among the more energetic and practical Europeans, one of the central figures in the story of the development of monasticism in Europe is Saint Benedict, who lives between 480 and 544. He was born at Spoleto in Italy, and he was a young man of good family and ability. The shadow The shadow of the times fell upon him, and like Buddha, he took to the religious life at first set no limit to his austerities. 50 miles from Rome is Subiaco, and there at the end of a gorge at the Agno, beneath a jungle growth of weeds and bushes, rose a deserted palace built by the Emperor Nero, overlooking an artificial lake that had been made in those days of departed prosperity by damming back the waters of the river. Here, with a hair shirt as his chief possession, Benedict took up the quarters in a cave in the high southward looking cliff that overhangs the stream in so inaccessible a position that his food had to be lowered to him. Really? Lowered to him on a cord by a faithful admirer. Can someone come and lower some food to me by a faithful admirer? 3 years he lived here, and his fame spread as Buddha's did nearly 1,000 years before under similar circumstances. As in the case of Buddha, the story of Benedict has been overlaid by foolish and credulous disciples with a mass of silly stories of miracles and manifestations. But presently, we find him no longer engaged in self torment, but controlling a group of 12 monasteries and the resort of a great number of people. Youths are brought to him to be educated, and the whole character of his life has changed. From Subiaco, he moved further northward to Monte Cassino, halfway between Rome and Naples, a lonely and beautiful mountain in the midst of a great circle of majestic heights. Here, it is interesting to note that in the 6th century AD, he found the temple of Apollo and a sacred grove and the countryside still worshipping at his shrine. At this shrine, his first laborers had to be missionary laborers, as it was with difficulty that he persuaded the simple pagans to demolish the temple and, and cut down the grove. The establishment upon Mont Casino. Like, how did he do that? Just, hey, get rid of the grove. Like, how did he convince them? The establishment upon Mount Casino became a famous and powerful center within the lifetime of its founder. Mixed up with the imbecile inventions of marvel loving monks about demons exorcised, disciples walking on the water, and dead children restored to life, we can still detect something of the real spirit of Benedict. Particularly are the stories that represent him as discouraging extreme mortification. He sent a damping message to a solitary who had invented a new degree in saintliness by chaining himself to a rock in a narrow cave. Break thy chain, said Benedict, for the true servant of God is chained not to rocks by iron, but to righteousness by Christ. And next to the discouragement of solitary self torture, it is Benedict's distinction that he insisted upon hard work. Through the legends shines the clear indication of the trouble made by his partition students and disciples who found themselves obliged to toil instead of leading lives of leisurely austerity under the ministrations of the lower class brethren. A third remarkable thing about Benedict was his political influence. He set himself to reconcile Goths and Italians, and it is clear that Totila, his Gothic king, came to him for counsel and was greatly influenced by him. Where are you? To clean my glasses. That's nice. Two hives, a bee suit. Well, what information do you want to share anyway? My movie? My George Floyd book? I mean, could just send her a link. Have forgiveness in your heart and let go. Obviously, you still love her despite the abuse. And next to the discouragement of solitary self torture is Benedict's distinction that he insisted upon hard work. Through the legend shines the clear indication of the trouble made by his patrician students and disciples who found themselves obliged to toil instead of leading lives of leisurely austerity. Allah, he set himself to reconcile Goths and Italians, and it is clear that Totila, his Gothic king, came to him for counsel. When Totila retook Naples from the Greeks, the Goths protected the women from insult and treated even the captured soldiers with humanity. Imagine that. When Belisarius, Justinian's general, had taken the same place 10 years previously, he had celebrated his triumph by a general massacre. Now, the monastic organization of Benedict was a very great beginning to the Western world. Does Benedict seem like a holy man to you? No, not to me. Seems like a capitalist. One of his prominent followers was Pope Gregory the Great, the first monk to become pope. He was one of the most capable and energetic of the popes, sending successful missions to the unconverted and particularly to the Anglo Saxons. He ruled in Rome like an independent king, organizing armies, making treaties. To his influence is due to the imposition of the Benedictine rule upon nearly the whole of Latin monasticism. Closely associated with these two names in the development of civilization, of a civilizing monasticism, out of the merely egoistic mortifications of the early recluses, is that of Cassiodorus. He was evidently much senior to Pope Gregory and younger by 10 years than Benedict. And like these two, he belonged to a patrician family, a Syrian family settled in Italy. He had a considerable official career under the Gothic kings. And when, between 545 and 553, the overthrow of those kings and the great pestilence paved the way for the new barbaric rule of the Lombards, he took refuge in a monastic career. He founded a monastery upon his private estates and said the monks be gathered to work in quite the Benedictine fashion. To whether his monks actually followed the Benedictine rule, and now you have the Benedict monks, right? So I guess they work a lot, aka slave labor. I don't know. Whether his monks actually followed the Benedictine rule that was being formulated almost the same time from Monte Cassino, we do not know. But there can be no questions of his influence upon the development of this great working teachings and studying order. It is evident that he was profoundly impressed by the universal decay of education and the possible loss of all learning and of the ancient literature by the world. And from the first, he directed his brethren to the task of preserving and restoring those things. He collected ancient MSS and caused them to be copied. He made sundials, water clocks, nice, and similar apparatus at last, a little last gleam of experimental science to the gathering darkness. He wrote a history of the Gothic kings, and what is more significant of his sense of the needs of the time, he produced a series of school books on the liberal arts and grammar. Probably his influence was even greater than that of Saint Benedict in making monasticism into a powerful instrument for the restoration of social order in the Western world. The spread of monasteries of the Benedictine order would type into the 7th and 8th centuries was very considerable. Everywhere we find them as centers of light, restoring, maintaining, and raising the standard of cultivation, preserving some type of elementary education, spreading useful arts, multiplying and storing books, and keeping before the eyes of the world the spectacle, an example of a social backbone. For 8 centuries henceforth, the European monastic system remained a system of patches and fibers of enlightenment in what might otherwise have been a wholly chaotic world. Closely, what might closely associate with the Benedictine monasteries were the schools that grew presently into the medieval universities. These schools of the Roman world had been altogether swept away in the general social breakdown. There was a time when very few priests in Britain or Gaul could read the gospel of the service books. Only gradually was teaching restored to the world. But when it was restored, it came back not as the duty work of a learned slave, but as the religious services of a special class of devoted men. In the East, also, there was a breadth of educational continuity, but there was the cause, but there the cause was not so much social disorder as religious intolerance, and the break by no means so complete. Justinian closed and disappeared the schools of Athens, 529, but he did this very largely in order to destroy a rival to the new school he was setting up in Constantinople, which was more directly under imperial control. Since the new Latin learning of the developing Western universities had no textbooks and literature of its own, it had, in spite of its strong theological bias to the country, to depend very largely upon the Latin classics and the Latin translation of the Greek literature. It was obliged to preserve far more of that splendid literature than it had a mind to do. Okay, well, that's the end of that chapter. It's a very old book. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's great that you have an extensive library. Hi, Jimmy. I don't know if you guys are still here. Anyways, I just came on. How old is that? It belongs to Snuffy. It's, I guess, a consolation prize. If I hopefully I rather see him give him back his book, but it's from 1920. It's as old as this book, and I accidentally ripped a page. Um, yeah, it's very old. Macmillan Company, Review of Reviews, H.G. Wells, The Outline of History. Yeah, maybe I'll read more another time. Wow, it's a shitload of chapters. Justinian the Great, the decay of Syria and the Sasanians, the travel of Yuan Shuang, who's that? Intellectual Letters of China, the First Punic War, the Second Punic War, Aristotle, Plato in the Academy, the Athens of Parisies, Socrates, Alexandria as a factory of religions, the science of Alexandria. The fact that he didn't mention anything, obviously, on the Council of Nicaea and reincarnation, lists of maps. Yeah, it's old. Yeah, oops, above the page. I really did it by accident. All right, well, I was told cheese slice farts in my mouth, my British accent. So I do my show on Fridays at 3, and I'm really not liked on YouTube. I'm mostly on Rumble, even there it's like the conservative version of YouTube. So Cheese Slice told me to come every day and do like 10 minutes, which I did an hour and 30 minutes. Okay. Have a happy Sunday. It's raining over here. I'm waiting for it to stop raining so we go for a bike ride. In my solitude, I'm in my own cave. Okay, blessings, everyone. Thank you. I do hope you'll check out my book, my George Floyd book, which is equally as big as his book, because I could be reading this, but it's not just about George Floyd, it's about everything around it: fentanyl, Sinaloa government. This picture. I bought these with my own money. And I realized after that I did it for the future that I was assigned. I was chosen to write this book. And the book I'm writing now is way more enjoyable. There's part on the Masons. I'll read you some of the chapters. It's dedicated to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but. Not half truth. George Floyd and the Rise of Jacobian Justice. Introduction to a PSYOP. A Tale of Two Autopsies. The Summer of Love. Keith Ellison body cam footage. Cover Up at Cup Foods. Ozarks on COVID-19 Operation Counterfeit. The Politics Behind Prosecution. Snitches Get Stitches. Derek Chauvin, off-duty cop, real estate agent, convicted murderer, sacrificial land, blood debts and human sacrifice, tax evasion. Time-lapse, 6 ways to detect a false flag event, the anatomy of a psychological operation. So, it is expensive, $66, but really, come on, 5 fucking years. Could you ever really pay me enough? No. So you can use gfbook.com, and I am working on the Audible, but even that's money that I would normally have, because I am an abundant human being that's been oppressed and persecuted for my courage. Okay, well, thank you for joining me. Thank you. Hi, Peaceful Penguin. I haven't seen you in a while. I don't know if you watched the show. The thing is, people are know to go to YouTube, but the show is every share. I'm not asking you to share this, but sharing my Substack means a lot. I'm a journalist, a writer. I'm actually talking to Sarah Westall, and I'm gonna talk to a couple of my colleagues about creating some type of cross-pollinating, because they took about 10 of my subscribers, and this is like the way I feed myself. I'm trying to make my rent in 4 days, so it's too bad journalism isn't prized. Anyways, blessings. Do your shadow work. I think people are feeling that things are intense. I'm very fascinated by all the the range in regards to Three Eye Atlas. Yeah, sure. I would be very happy if there was a rapture. My heart is as light as a feather, and I have no skeletons in my closet. I'm just dealing with my PTSD and my very short fuse towards stupidity. But I get it. People will be coming back here for many years to come because it takes thousands of years to evolve your soul. If you think, you know, you might be 42 or something, but you're still a child and immature. So, how about your soul, right? There's a soul evolution. Even if your soul is eternal, because of the memory wipe, and the veil is getting thinner, and we all have an opportunity to remember. I remember. So, marymunane.substack.com is where I'm putting forth installments for what will be my second book, which I will turn into a TV series, even if I have to take my name off of it, because somehow it'll eventually go back to, they'll figure out I'm on some crap list. And yeah, many people are enjoying it. I'm enjoying writing it very much. Whereas this was a little hard to write, meaning, I mean, it's dark, but, and also I was doing a live investigation at the time, and seriously, at least half of the footnotes are like completely gone, even from archive.org. Okay, blessings. Thank you. How do you end this? End stream.